My own signature looked back at me from the screen, a perfect, elegant forgery on a document that legally declared me a ghost in my own life. It was late, well past midnight in this cold Atlanta house where silence was a commodity more valuable than the chrome appliances humming in the kitchen. I had found my way here after a desperate hunch, a password guessed from the name of my grandson's first puppy, Leo and Sparky 2018. A child's simple love, a key to a grown man's deceit. The folder was labeled Vacation Pics, a lie as polished as my son-in-law's smile. But inside, there were no sunny beaches, only the stark black and white of my own erasure. A petition for conservatorship, financial power of attorney forms, medical releases I'd never seen. He had built a paper version of me, a woman who was incompetent, senile, and in desperate need of his careful management. My years as a reference librarian had taught me to look for the source, to verify the information. Here, the source was my own name, signed with a flourish I hadn't used in years, and the information was a meticulously constructed fiction designed to steal my world. I leaned closer to the laptop's glow, my reflection a pale mask in the dark screen. With a trembling finger, I scrolled to the bottom of the petition, looking for a date, a notary stamp, anything to anchor this nightmare in reality. And then I saw it, not in the body of the text, but embedded in the file's properties. The creation date. It was 6 weeks ago, 2 full weeks before I had even called the realtor to list my home in Charleston. The tea had gone cold in my hands hours earlier. Mark had called it chamomile, a cup to help me rest. But my grandson's words kept ringing in my head, a tiny, clear bell of alarm in the muffled quiet of the house. He had put his sleepy medicine in it again. 12 hours ago, I had been standing in this same gleaming kitchen, the afternoon sun glinting off surfaces so sterile they held no warmth. Mark had handed me the delicate porcelain cup, his voice the same smooth balm he used on his clients. "Just to help you relax, Bia, you've seemed a little on edge." I was raising it to my lips when Leo, my sweet 6-year-old grandson, abandoned his coloring book and ran to my side. His small hand clamped onto my wrist with surprising strength. His eyes, usually full of light and mischief, were wide with a fear that a child should never have to know. "Grandma, no," he'd whispered, his breath warm against my skin. "Don't drink the tea Daddy made. He put his sleepy medicine in it again." In that instant, the world stopped turning. The suffocating kindness, the gentle insistence that I let him handle my mail, my passwords, my life, it all snapped into focus. It wasn't care, it was a cage. My heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but 45 years of quiet service behind a library desk had taught me to keep my face a calm, placid mask. I smiled down at Leo, patted his head, and then turned back to Mark, who was busy at the sink. I lifted the cup, pretended to take a long, slow sip, and then, as I turned away, I faked a coughing fit, a sudden rattling little spasm that allowed me to discreetly spit the bitter liquid into the napkin clutched in my hand. That night, clutching the damning damp napkin in my robe pocket, I didn't just suspect, I knew. My erasure had a flavor, and it was bitter. I didn't mean to find his practice runs. They were buried deep in the cloud drive, in a subfolder simply titled Drafts, as if he were rehearsing my disappearance before the main performance. After finding the signed petition, a cold, methodical part of my mind took over, the part that knew how to follow a reference trail to its source. I clicked, and the screen filled with the architecture of his betrayal. The first file was a scanned copy of a handwritten list on a yellow legal pad. My name was at the top, and below it, a list of my supposed symptoms. "Forgets names of new neighbors," one line read, with a note in the margin, "Embellish. Say she called Mrs. Peters by her old Charleston neighbor's name." Another entry noted, "Confused about day of the week," with the addition, "Mention missed doctor's appointment." It was a script, and I was the unwitting actor. The second file was an early draft of a letter to a geriatric specialist whose name I didn't recognize. It was full of concerned language about my rapidly advancing dementia. But the most chilling part was seeing my daughter Jessica's name typed next to his as a cosigner, a thick black line drawn through it by hand. In the margin, in Mark's precise script, was a single, cold note. Better if she's surprised, more authentic. He wasn't just lying to me, he was preparing to ambush his own wife with his manufactured crisis. The final piece was a calendar file. For the last 2 months, there were appointments labeled EP Consult, scheduled during times Mark had claimed to be at his office gym, sweating on a treadmill. Estate planning. He hadn't just been working out a sweat, he'd been working out the final details of how to steal my life. Angela read the printouts without speaking, her face a study in concentration. We were in a small, anonymous coffee shop, miles from Mark's curated suburban world, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee and sugar. I had made the call that morning, excusing myself for a walk and finding a quiet bench in a nearby park. "The magnolias here aren't blooming right," was all I'd said. It was our old code, from when we were children, a signal that something was deeply wrong. My niece, a paralegal with a mind as sharp as a paper cut, was on a flight from Philadelphia by nightfall. Now she sat across from me, her brow smooth until she reached the scanned page with the margin note about my daughter. Then her eyes hardened into chips of flint. She didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. Angela dealt in facts and strategy. She pushed the papers into a neat stack, her movements precise. "He's arrogant, Aunt Bee," she said, her voice low and steady. "He thinks because you're older, you're invisible. He used his work computer, he left a digital trail a mile wide, and he got sloppy." She tapped a finger on the forged conservatorship document, pointing to 2 names listed as witnesses. "Cynthia Morris and a David Chen. Do you know these people?" I shook my head. "Of course you don't," she continued, a grim certainty in her voice. "We start here. Neither of these people has ever stepped foot inside your daughter's life, or yours. I guarantee it." In that moment, sitting in a plastic chair under flickering lights, my fear began to recede, replaced by the first flicker of a cold, clear resolve. We weren't just victims anymore. We were a team. "I remember the call," the receptionist said, her voice hesitant after a long pause on the other end of the line. "He sounded very convincing, asking careful questions about cognitive decline, and then the follow-up appointment he booked was canceled an hour later." Angela was in her hotel room, which she had turned into a makeshift command center. She had me on speaker, my phone muted so I could hear everything. Posing as a personal assistant for a law firm, she was making her way through a list of discreet inquiries. This call to the geriatric specialist Mark had named in his draft letter was the first one to bear fruit. Angela's voice was perfectly modulated, a smooth blend of professional courtesy and mild impatience. "We're just trying to reconcile our client's records," she said. "A Mr. Mark Peterson made an inquiry regarding his mother-in-law, a Beatrice Coleman, about 2 months ago." The receptionist confirmed it. She remembered because he was unusually smooth, asking detailed questions about the legal threshold for declaring a relative incompetent. He had booked a preliminary consultation for his mother-in-law without explanation, then called back to cancel it, claiming it had been a false alarm. He had played it off as a concerned son-in-law, but something had stuck with the woman. Something about his polish felt off. Angela was about to thank her and hang up when the receptionist lowered her voice, a conspiratorial whisper. "He gave us her full name and date of birth to start a file. Against policy, I kept the intake notes. It just felt wrong. They're dated. They're detailed." "This isn't sloppy greed," the forensic accountant said, his voice a calm, steady baritone over the secure line from Austin. "This is a constructed financial narrative. It's designed to look like a rescue." Angela had brought in one of her most trusted contacts, a man named David Chen, who specialized in untangling the finances of white-collar criminals. On a three-way encrypted call, I gave him the login details for my original Charleston bank accounts, the ones Mark had promised to simplify for me. It took David less than an hour to see the full picture. He explained it to me not in complex terms, but with a simple analogy. He told you he was building you a safe, single-story house, Mrs. Coleman. Instead, he built a maze of paper rooms, each one leading to an account he controlled. The money from my home sale, the nest egg my husband and I had carefully built over 45 years, hadn't gone into a simple joint advisory account. It had been funneled through a series of newly created shell LLCs with generic names like Peachtree Holdings and Southern Legacy. David pointed out something else, something that spoke to Mark's arrogance. He made several of the largest transfers on Sundays, he explained. The markets are closed. It's a classic amateur move, trying to hide activity in the off hours, thinking no one is watching. His voice was grimly certain. He's built a house of cards, but he used your money for the foundation. The court order to freeze everything goes in this afternoon, quietly. I found my original trust, where I kept old tax receipts, tucked away in a cardboard box from Charleston, as if my values were just another line item to be reconciled. While Mark was at work and Jessica was at her demanding job, I spent the afternoon sifting through the pieces of my old life that I'd brought with me to this cold new one. The box smelled of cedar and thyme. Beneath old photo albums and stacks of letters, I found the heavy vellum folder. It was my original estate plan, drafted with my late husband Thomas 20 years ago, properly signed and notarized. I ran my fingers over the pages, the legal language a comfort, a testament to a life built on clarity and mutual respect. It clearly outlined survivor protections, our shared charitable intentions for the local library, and specific clauses we had added to ensure my financial independence should anything happen to him. It was a document of love and foresight. Tucked into the front cover was a small yellow sticky note, the paper curled with age. I had forgotten all about it. It was from the week after Thomas's funeral, when Mark had first offered to look over my finances. My own handwriting, a little shaky from grief, read, "Showed this to Mark. He said it was too complicated and that he'd handle simplifying it for me." I sat on the floor of that sterile guest room, surrounded by my memories, and held the proof of his long-laid plan in my hand. The evidence was photographed, time-stamped, and sent to Angela by noon. Granted. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the perfectly smooth, unadorned white wall, when my phone vibrated. I didn't cheer, I didn't cry. I simply sat there and exhaled for what felt like the first time in a month. A long, slow release of tension that left my shoulders aching. A judge, a stranger in a black robe somewhere downtown, had signed the emergency order. Every account Mark had created, every LLC he had formed with my money, was now frozen solid. He could see the money, but he couldn't touch a single dime. For the first time since that terrible afternoon in the kitchen, I felt like I had a small patch of solid ground beneath my feet. The power dynamic, which had been so crushingly one-sided, had subtly shifted. I had a shield. That same afternoon, I came downstairs to find a thick, glossy invitation lying on the polished quartz of the kitchen island. Mark must have brought in the mail. He was in the living room, on the phone, his voice its usual confident murmur. I picked up the heavy cardstock. In an elegant, swirling script, it invited me to a formal family dinner he was hosting in 2 weeks. I read the fine print at the bottom, and a cold wave washed over me. The stated purpose on the card: to celebrate family and discuss the best path forward for Mom's continuing care. It was an invitation to my own demise, curated by the man who was trying to write me out of existence. He'd placed my favorite porcelain teacups on the mantelpiece as props for his story. She loves these, he told Jessica during the pre-dinner cocktail hour, his voice laced with tender concern. Brought them all the way from Charleston. My heart gave a painful thud. I had sold those teacups, a beautiful Royal Albert set with the Charleston house. He had bought cheap replicas from a department store, banking on the idea that my mind was too far gone to notice the difference. I played my part, the sweet, slightly confused grandmother he had been carefully cultivating in everyone's mind. I smiled vaguely, accepted the gentle, pitying looks from my daughter, and listened. I was not there to fight. I was there to gather intelligence, to hear his narrative in his own words. He regaled Jessica with anecdotes about my supposed memory lapses, each one a carefully twisted version of a real event. An afternoon I spent quietly reading in my room became a day she wouldn't come out, just staring at the walls. A simple question about a TV show was spun into, she's having trouble following simple plots now. He was a master performer, and I was his star subject. I watched my own daughter's face fill with worry, her love for me being weaponized against me, and it took every ounce of my strength to keep my placid smile in place. He then mentioned an incident where I had supposedly gotten lost driving to the grocery store, pinpointing the date. It was that awful Tuesday last month, remember? I was so worried. My heart hammered against my ribs. That Tuesday was the exact date the accountant had flagged for the single largest illegal transfer of my funds. The metadata doesn't lie. Angela's voice was sharp and clear over the phone the next day. The file was created at 2:15 p.m. on a Wednesday from a computer with an IP address registered to his firm's headquarters in downtown Atlanta. She had spent 2 days working with a digital forensics expert, and the results were in. This was the irrefutable evidence, the key that would unlock his entire deception. She explained it to me in librarian's terms, language I could understand. Think of it like the card in the back of a library book, Aunt B. It's stamped with who checked it out, when, and where. He created the petition to have you declared incompetent on his work computer during work hours. This wasn't just a family betrayal anymore, it was a massive compliance violation. Using company resources to commit fraud could cost him his license, his career, everything he had built his polished identity on. I listened, my hand gripping the phone, the cold reality of it sinking in. This was no longer just about my money, it was about his entire professional life. And the access logs for the witnesses are even better, Angela added, her voice tight with satisfaction. His firm's building has keycard access for security. We subpoenaed the logs. Security records show neither of their keycards, Cynthia Morris or David Chen, were used to enter the building that entire week. They never witnessed a thing. He forged their signatures too. The letter from his lawyer was polished, cold, and full of threats. It arrived by courier the day after Mark must have discovered the accounts were frozen. I watched from the window as he signed for the crisp, important-looking envelope. Our own response was sharper, shorter, and attached a single exhibit. He must have called his lawyers immediately because their cease and desist letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. It accused me of erratic behavior, of being unduly influenced by my niece, and threatened swift legal action for filial defamation and interference. It was designed to scare an old woman into submission. It did not work. Angela, on my behalf, drafted a single-page rebuttal. It was calm, factual, and stated our position without emotion. It simply said that all financial transactions were being reviewed due to significant irregularities, and that we would not be communicating further until our review was complete. Attached as Exhibit A was not our entire case file, not the witness statements or the financial records. It was one simple, devastating printout, a screenshot of the conservatorship petition's metadata, clearly showing the creation date, the 2:15 p.m. timestamp, and the geotag pinpointing the address of his office building. We sent it electronically. The response from his lawyer came in just under 2 hours. All threats were dropped. The new subject line was stripped of its aggression. It read simply, "Request for private mediation." They had greenlit his surrender. "We only want what's best for her," Mark said, his voice thick with grave sincerity as he looked across the dining table at my daughter. I waited for his pause, the moment he took a breath to continue his performance. Then I slid a single white envelope across the polished mahogany surface. It came to a stop right beside Jessica's wine glass. It was just the three of us now, seated for the family dinner he had arranged. He was clearly unaware of the legal exchange that had happened, still moving forward with his plan to convince Jessica of my decline. He had just finished a long, heartfelt speech about my memory lapses, my increasing confusion, and the difficult decisions that lay ahead for our family. He performed his concern perfectly, a tear even welling in the corner of his eye. As he finished, I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The quiet slide of the envelope was enough. Jessica looked at it, then at me, her brow furrowed in confusion. She picked it up and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. It was the same printout we had sent his lawyer, the metadata. I watched her eyes scan the page. I saw the moment she registered the creation date, from before I even lived with them. I saw her focus on the timestamp, smack in the middle of a workday. And I saw her breath catch as she read the location tag, the address of her husband's office building. The color drained from her face, leaving it pale and drawn. She looked up from the paper, not at me, but at her husband, her voice a raw whisper. "Explain this, now." There was no confession. There was no dramatic breakdown, no tearful admission of guilt. There was only a carefully worded statement to Jessica later that night about a terrible misunderstanding and his difficult decision to step away to protect the family from unnecessary stress. He knew he was cornered. He was facing not just the loss of his family, but SEC violations, potential wire fraud charges, and the complete and public ruin of his career. So he folded. The aftermath was swift and silent. Angela handled the private settlement with his humbled lawyers. He relinquished all claims to my estate, signed documents that returned every single cent to a new account controlled only by me, and agreed to be out of the house by the end of the week. To Jessica, he framed his departure as a noble act, a sacrifice he was making for her peace of mind. I didn't correct him. The truth was there, on that single sheet of paper, and it was enough. Watching him pack his expensive suits and designer shoes into the trunk of his car felt less like a victory and more like the quiet, sad conclusion to a story that should never have been written. The night his car pulled away for the last time, its red taillights disappearing down the street, my phone buzzed. It was a one-line text from my daughter, the first direct thing she'd said to me in days. "You were right to protect what mattered. I'm so sorry, Mom." The brass plaque on my old front door had weathered a little more, but the promise of home hadn't faded one bit. 2 months after Mark drove away, I was standing on the familiar porch in Charleston, the key warm in my hand. The young couple who had bought my house were relocating for a job and were happy to sell it back to me. Walking through the familiar rooms was like seeing an old friend. The way the morning sun slanted through the living room window, the faint scent of sweetgrass and old books that clung to the air, the worn spot on the hardwood floor by the armchair where Thomas used to sit. This was my archive, the repository of my real life. I went to the built-in bookshelf in the study and pulled out the antique ledger where Thomas and I had kept all our important papers. I slid my original, untampered-with trust documents back into their rightful place. It was a small act, but it felt monumental, like restoring a precious volume to the correct shelf. As I closed the ledger, my fingers brushed against a sealed envelope tucked in the back that I hadn't seen in years. My name was on the front, in my late husband's familiar, steady script. Below it, he had written, "To be opened when the house feels too quiet." Inside, a single sheet of his old stationery held a clear, older truth. My dearest Beatrice, it began, your story is yours to write. Never let anyone else hold the pen. When I sat on the porch swing that evening, my old neighbors didn't applaud my return. There was no fanfare, no welcome party. They just nodded as they passed by on their evening walks, a silent, knowing welcome from people who had known me for 40 years. They didn't need to hear all the words of the story to understand its ending. The simple fact of my being there, on that swing, in that house, was enough. I held a cup of real chamomile tea in my hands, its gentle steam warming my face. Around my neck, I wore the small silver locket Thomas had given me on our 25th anniversary. It wasn't a talisman against evil, but a simple reminder of a life honorably lived. Jessica and Leah were coming to visit next week. It would be the beginning of a slow, honest repair, a story we would have to write together, word by painful word. I was no longer a victim, and I didn't feel like a warrior. I was simply Beatrice, the librarian from Charleston, who, when faced with a fraudulent text, knew how to find the primary source. I leaned my head back against the swing's chain, breathing in the cool, salt air from the harbor, and looked up at the open sky, my story finally written for good, in a hand that would never again be erased.